All right. Thanks, Thomas. It's always really great to be here. So jumping right into the usual kind of update on what's been happening on the ground in Gaza before we get to the ceasefire news. As always, a really horrific week of Israeli attacks. We've seen this sort of similar cadence going on for the last few months, where, since last Friday, the death count has once again gone up by about 1,000. So it's, fairly consistently 1,000 people being killed by Israel per week. And that's, again, we've talked about this so much, the official number, which particularly in this moment with the assault on Gaza City is even more of an undercount than usual in ways that you can listen to past episodes to get a sense of if you're not aware of this already. But what I wanted to do is just jump right into some of the ceasefire stuff, and get into the details of uh, how the plan kind of came together and where we are now. There's also this infographic that I thought was useful that folks can take a look at their leisure. Um, but the main piece here, of course, is that the underlying core aspect of what we often refer to as phase one of the ceasefire is now very much in effect. It has been for the last day or so. Um, and folks who have been watching the PSAs for a while know, we've sort of like broken down the ceasefire into these separate sub phases, even though this particular agreement is so vague that those phases don't really exist anymore. I think it's still helpful to understand it as sort of operating in three different pieces. And we'll get to what those second and third pieces mean shortly, but the critical aspect of this first phase of the ceasefire, the thing that has actually been agreed to, nothing else has actually formally been agreed to at this moment, is the exchange of political prisoners, right? Hamas has, and the other Palestinian militant factions have committed to return all living hostages and start the process of identifying the ones who have died under Israeli bombardment or starvation or whatever it may be. And the Israeli forces have committed to withdrawing partially from Gaza. There's still some lack of clarity about exactly how far the IDF is withdrawing, but it's something around 50%. So this like sort of core area inside Gaza is, we were already seeing like these troop withdrawals and force withdrawals from that area as this stage sort of comes into implementation. There's also a really big commitment for humanitarian aid, and we'll get into some of those details here. So folks maybe saw like these videos of, thousands upon thousands of Palestinians walking back to their homes in the north just after being displaced. If for folks who have been attending these last few PSAs, the extent of like these forced displacements in Gaza City in particular in the north, for some people the third, fourth, or fifth time they've been displaced like that, are already trying to return home. Often, as you can see in this like clip here, and in any of the videos you may watch, with only what they're carrying on their backs, if that, right? Like there is no fuel, there's no other way of getting there. They've been displaced so many times that the ability to sort of take anything with them is being steadily diminished. And so that resilience to go back to their homes in this moment, I think, is a really beautiful and really powerful thing for all of us to be witnessing. So getting into like the core aspects of this sort of phase one, these two articles, well, the BBC article on the left here, I think actually does a pretty good job of explaining what is in and what is not in this first phase of the ceasefire, and it is largely around the provision of humanitarian aid, the exchange of political prisoners, and the withdrawal of military forces, and this like temporary cessation of hostilities. We still don't have a great sense of what the next steps will be, and we'll get into some of that in future slides, but it's worth noting that none of that is actually in the agreement that has sort of been signed but hasn't been like sort of officially ratified, signed yet, even though for all intents and purposes the Palestinian factions agreed to it. The Israeli cabinet just today, I think, agreed to it. So those pieces are in effect, while the other pieces are like yet to be negotiated in a way that is a really kind of clever like turning on its head of the original agreement that was presented to Hamas and the other factions last week. We talked about how they were going to get out of that impossible situation, and again, we'll come to that in a bit. But moving on with the other thing to note on phase one is just the extent of that IDF withdrawal, which I think is really critical, and then also really importantly, who is being exchanged in this prisoner exchange, right? So not only, of course, are the living Israeli political prisoners supposed to all be released in the next few days, but the who those people are being exchanged for is a really critical test of what's happening in this moment and how we understand it. And one I think way we can assess the relative bargaining power of the parties here is who's included in that list among Palestinian political prisoners. Particularly, I would say Marwan Barghouti, who has been a really high priority person to be released. Um, and something that Hamas has said from the very beginning was one of the core objectives of the original plan of like taking Israeli soldiers as political prisoners and exchanging them. From what I've heard, and a lot of this is still hearsay in this moment, um, the the Israelis had in fact agreed to release him, um, and just I think yesterday or earlier today, it sounds like Netanyahu himself got cold feet and sort of pulled back on that. There's a real fear, I think, of letting Marwan Barghouti out as a extremely popular Palestinian political figure that I think is one of the singular people that many perceive to be as capable of sort of like uniting the various Palestinian movements under one person. So it's not surprising that Israel is not letting him go. And in fact, Netanyahu said today that they'll never let him go. So, the fact that they can get away with something like that, I think really speaks to the underlying power dynamics of what's happening here, and obviously really frustrating in a lot of different ways. But that's where we are in this moment. It's also worth noting that the dead Israeli prisoners are ooh, the dead Israeli prisoners are supposed to also be returned, the bodies of the ones that Hamas and the other Palestinian factions took, but like, how are they going to find those people? Many of them are hidden under rubble, right? They're in areas that are totally inaccessible. So the idea of everybody getting returned within the next 72 hours, I think, is really unrealistic. And I think all the parties know that. And the way that that delay might impact the implementation of this agreement, I think, is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on over the next couple of days. And so I think the big question here on phase one is, will it hold, right? Like, are we in a moment where that even this preliminary cessation of hostilities, will it lead to a sort of lasting pause, at least, or a stop of like the massive ethnic cleansing in Gaza City and the ongoing, hot level of this Israeli genocide, where we're seeing the daily bombardments and drone strikes and forced displacements. And it's, obviously it's impossible to say. God knows Israel has no compunctions about breaking these sorts of deals. They've done it every single time so far. Up till a couple of days ago, Netanyahu was specifically saying that there was absolutely no way that Israel would stop its military assault on Gaza. He seems to have changed his tune literally in the past 24 or 36 hours. But the fact that I think we're in a moment where Trump is really personally very involved in making sure that this piece of the agreement actually holds. And he issued a statement just today again saying that he's not willing to let things go back to like the active military conflict. I think does put the Israelis in a bit of a bind. And so I think it's more likely than not that phase one will hold. And so I think there are a lot of implications of that, in addition to like what it means about moving into phase two and phase three. I think even the existence of phase one and the ability for, the Palestinian people in Gaza and any observers that are either allowed in or allowed to talk to Palestinians in Gaza, given the sort of like massive blackout and censorship campaign, will be really revealing. And I think that the coming weeks, we're going to see a lot, sort of, like when the smoke clears kind of thing, like looking at the extent to which like Israel's crimes in Gaza specifically will be sort of like revealed at a level and with a level of clarity and transparency that we hadn't seen before. And this, you can go to the next slide, Thomas. And so like, even just this week, right, we've seen a couple of things come out that we hadn't had like direct evidence for before, including, Israel's torture of medical workers that they've been taking from Gaza, campaigns of mass rape and other sexual violence that again we've heard a lot about, but evidence is actually now being submitted to bodies and things that wouldn't have been possible at the same level or the same cadence were it not for this like immediate cessation. And some of this stuff is happening like literally over the last 12, 24 hours. And so we can imagine that over the next week or two, or in the next few months, assuming this holds, there is going to be, an unimaginable level of information about how much worse Israel has comported itself in Gaza than I think anyone really imagined, except for us, obviously, who have been following it very closely. But most people, aren't hearing these sorts of things, and they're sort of cut themselves off from sort of the direct, like social media or whatever other ways that we can access that information directly. So I think it's really important to stay attuned to that and make sure to amplify those stories as they come out. So given all of this, I think like this might be the moment to sort of take a step back and just be like, how did we get here? Like, why are we now in this moment where the ceasefire has been signed? And it's possible that this is going to lead to an end of like this last 2 years of, accelerated genocidal violence. And there's a few things I think that we can point to here, and I think we can look specifically at what's changed for Trump and maybe what's changed for Hamas, and how to understand those things as they relate to whether or not this thing is going to hold and what it's going to look like going forward. So just to say very quickly, it does seem like, if nothing else, the Israeli bombing of Qatar does seem to be a really important catalyst here. And I don't think it's like the singular explanation for any of this, but I do think it's really important to understand, like this sort of growing realization among Israel's allies, and by, Trump personally, that like the extent to which Israel is presenting this massive destabilization force across the region is something that they're like, okay, like this can't keep going. Like the bombing of a U.S. ally to kill negotiators, like in a residential suburb, and like only getting sort of perfunctory permission from the United States to do it, I think was enough to just be like, okay, that's, that along with pressure from Trump's base, like widespread disapproval of Israel, and his sort of ongoing attempt to be portrayed as like a global peacemaker or whatever. It's for whatever reason, Trump sort of had enough, right? And like put his foot down on getting something signed and getting the military conflict de-escalated. And I think it's really critical in this moment to reflect on the fact that based on nothing but being like, okay, I want to do this now, Trump was able to make this happen within a few days, right? Like, a week or two, if you consider the sort of long tail of like, the meeting with Arab leaders and whatever that we've discussed on past PSAs. And that's not to say that like Trump, the singular genius, was able to sort of bring the parties together and get it to be signed, but rather that like any American leader at any point could have stopped this within a week if they had wanted to. And Trump could have stopped this a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And Biden could have stopped this, 1 year and 11 months ago. And it was just that no one had actively really tried to do it because nobody cared. And, both US presidents from both parties were very happy to just let Israel continue its genocide, not only unabated, but actively supported, right, at the cost of not only billions of dollars of US taxpayers, but also like the political capital that even the Republican Party seems to be burning by backing Israel to the hilt. And I think that's a really sort of fascinating dynamic that deserves a lot more like inspection, but not right now. So that's what's happening on the US side, but also just to say, I think for Hamas, we had discussed in the last PSA this question about how Hamas was going to respond to the ceasefire offer that was both impossible to accept and impossible to reject, because they were sort of forced into a corner where they couldn't be the ones to be perceived as the only party that was abandoning the peace effort, so to speak, but also the terms as they were written and rewritten by Netanyahu after originally being designed by Trump and the Arab League, were basically capitulation not just for Hamas but the entire Palestinian movement for self-determination, right? Like it calls for, among other things, giving up all unilateral efforts to bring Israel to account, right? They had to like withdraw their case with the ICC and the ICJ. They had to, like stop nonviolent resistance and boycotts. It was an impossible deal to accept. But Hamas did something I think a lot of people maybe weren't expecting, I certainly wasn't expecting, which was to sort of thread a really careful needle here where they agreed to the ceasefire and the exchange of political prisoners, that being like the kind of core thing that probably Trump cared about. And they did it in a way that really put the onus on Trump himself as a singular individual to move this thing forward. And that's a huge gamble, right? Given the fact that A, Trump is extremely fickle, so anything he agrees to, he might forget about, tomorrow. His word is worthless. Um, and also, like, obviously, Trump doesn't actually care about the Palestinians, has been happy to sort of lure them into traps before. And, it's not a dissimilar thing that they did with the Iranians, where like they're like, oh yeah, let's talk, and then use that as an opportunity to exterminate leadership. So it's a huge, huge gamble, I think, that they're taking, but it's one that could pay off if Trump perceives his own political fortunes being tied to this ceasefire moving forward. And for the moment, at least, that does seem to be the case. That can change. But so far, it does seem like that's a reasonably good gamble given the situation that they're in. But hard to say. Um, so the implementation of the ceasefire agreement, I think like is sort of resting on Trump's assurances, right, that things are not going to go back to active conflict. He said himself, right, he made like a promise that that's not going to happen. And I think, again, it just reflects poorly on him. And he's so vain that it actually matters on some level that he does, like he's put his own stamp on this and therefore it sort of has to hold. Folks may have seen the news about 200 troops being sent to Israel to monitor the deal. This, on its face, looks like really bad news because anytime the US sends troops, that's usually a really bad thing. But in this case, I would actually say that it's on the balance probably good for a couple of reasons. One, these troops are not, in fact, going to Gaza. They're not setting foot in Gaza, which is important, which is not to say that there aren't, US mercenaries are all over Gaza already. But this particular 200 are just going into 48 outside of Gaza in Israel. And they're there to basically say they're there to monitor the implementation of the agreement basically so that what Israel did in January, where they're like, oh, Hamas violated the ceasefire, we're going to start bombing them again. There's like sort of a semi-independent monitor happening there, and whether the U.S. will admit that Israel is the one unilaterally breaking a ceasefire is, I wouldn't put too much optimism in that, but the fact that that check is even there is a better dynamic than it was before, I would say, on the whole. It's not good, but like on the whole, it's not horrible. And then the other key piece of this is, of course, the inflow of humanitarian aid, where there should be, hopefully, in the coming days, this massive influx of aid, whether or not Israel gives the green light for that, because again, it just depends on Israel letting that aid in. It's just sitting there on the border, ready to be delivered in sufficient quantities to really make a massive difference in the lives of the Palestinian people in Gaza right now. So pressure on getting that in is a critical aspect of what's happening right now. And so I think if we're not seeing those large inflows of aid in the next day or so, I would say that that's a really critical pressure point that like folks, in the U.S. in particular, but everywhere, I think need to be protesting and sort of making a key point of pressure for the U.S. and other Western powers to sort of force Israel's hand on this, as has happened many times before. Since I don't have all the time or all the wisdom to get into the other details of what's happening so far, I did want to point folks to some analysis that already exists that I think it is really powerful and really useful. The IMEU policy project did a really good job of showing like why this is both good and fraught with potential like landmines along the way. And then Melina Beni has a really good analysis of what the prospects are of this agreement and where it goes from here. And so I just recommend folks read those when they have time. These people are much smarter than I am. But what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, and like what I sort of did to help myself think through what's going on in this moment, was sort of charted out as my nerdy love of flowcharts. I know this is probably not the easiest thing to read, but I might just spend a couple minutes going through my thinking here and see if it's helpful for others. It might not be, which is fine. But basically what I wanted to do here was think through, how we get from where we are right now to coming out of the consequences of the last 2 years of this genocide, better positioned for Palestinian liberation, or not, right? Like what needs to happen, not to get to Palestinian liberation, right? Where that's a big fight that requires a lot of things, but at least to create the foundations that are necessary for us to get to a point where we can really see a free Palestine. And so, we're obviously right at the beginning of this, at the hostage exchange and troop withdrawal. Um, if that falls apart, obviously, then the question becomes whether the U.S. will actually exert its pressure to prevent Israel from going back and restarting the invasion bombardments, ethnic cleansing, whatever. If it doesn't, then we're back to square one, right? War resumes, and I've got genocide in parentheses here, not because it's meant to be diminishing that. It is clearly a genocide, but because all the bottom red row is genocide, right? Like, even if the Israeli troops don't, go back and forth into Gaza, there's still an active genocide happening here, right? By making the conditions there unlivable. So, what I'm specifically talking about here is like the IDF going back into Gaza and resuming their bombing campaign and things. If the US does prevent a new assault, then we're in this sort of stagnation attrition stage, right? Where Gaza can't be rebuilt. The remaining pieces of the ceasefire that need to happen won't be implemented. And we're stuck with the status quo, Gaza as it is now, which inevitably, right, without question, inevitably has to sort of lead back into hot war, right? Because the underlying material conditions to create stability don't exist, right? And that might not happen for months or years or whatever, but as has happened in these last many cycles of Israel attacking Gaza, in 2018 and 2000, like these sort of the underlying material conditions don't change, and therefore the thing happens again and again, right? If we do get through the hostage exchange and troop withdrawal, then we're into sort of this phase two of the ceasefire. Like, will there actually be a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza? Will there be like a stabilization force or whatever being put into place so that it's not the Israelis that are on the ground or whatever? If not, then we're back to square one, obviously. If there is a full withdrawal and like a pulling out of Israel's control over Gaza, is that done in a way that actually has Palestinian sovereignty, right? Do Palestinians have any control over what Gaza actually looks like? If you have Tony Blair as the governor of the Gaza Strip, or I guess the viceroy, in this sort of like horrific colonial throwback, that also obviously doesn't create the conditions where you can fix the underlying material issues here. And so if there is no Palestinian sovereignty, you again loop right back down to the beginning, right? So if like it's an international peacekeeping force, but it's run as a sort of colonial power that's designed to keep the Palestinians under their boot, that's not really that different than the Israelis being there, right? There will be less murderous violence, not none, but less, but the underlying conditions don't change, right? So if the Palestinians are able to sort of, manage to control what is happening in Gaza, then we get to reconstruction stabilization, right? Are we able to rebuild Gaza, which is a massive undertaking, right? We're talking about an unimaginable level of ordnance, destruction, rubble in a really, really tiny area. And I think that cuts two different ways, right? One, there's so much destruction in such a small area that it's going to be a really, really big undertaking. On the other hand, it is such a small area, right? It's like the size of the Bay Area, not even. That like if there is the political will to do this, reconstruction is very much possible, right? We're not talking about a lot of land here. The problem is, I would say, and obviously if we don't go through reconstruction, we are again back to square one. But if we do go through reconstruction, again, is this done in a way with Palestinian sovereignty? Do they have control over how things are being rebuilt and what it looks like? This was my own like professional background before I moved back to the United States, was working on like reconstruction and stabilization projects. And like what is the norm here is, these massive $100 million, billion contracts that are afforded to these Western companies to rebuild. And because there's no accountability there, because there's no like, they're not actually reporting to the people who are supposed to benefit from that reconstruction, right? Then you're going to end up, nowhere, right? Like nothing's going to get properly built. Everything's going to be like, kind of half done. The corruption's going to be through the roof. And, this is like the perfect opportunity for your snake oil, whatever, everyone's going to be talking about building like an AI whatever, like tech utopia nonsense. And it's going to go nowhere, right? And this leads us to, the third red square here, that like if we don't have Palestinian sovereignty in the reconstruction process, we end up in neoliberal hell, right? So like there may be rebuilding here, but it's not going to be done in a way that gives Palestinian people dignity, the respect and the ability to live their lives in a way that isn't like, horrifically exploitative, and like, without the basic conditions for human survival and thriving. So if we end up in neoliberal hell, again, it is only a matter of time before we go back to a period of stagnation and then from there back to war. And so making sure that there is accountability in the reconstruction process is another critical piece for us in the United States and elsewhere to make sure that it's done in a way that Palestinians actually have control over, and that it's not just a cash grab, for Western corporations and public-private partnerships or whatever it may be. And then even if we get through that, then there's the question of like, will there actually be consequences for what happened here, right? Is Israel going to be held to account for its war crimes, for its attempted genocide? Will there be pariah statehood? Will the state of Israel no longer look the same as a result of all of this, right? Like, will it lose its sort of cachet within the Western world? And if not, again, we're going to end up in neoliberal hell because Israel will continue to control and dominate and exploit Gaza and the West Bank, obviously, and Palestinians inside 48. And that, again, leads us right back to where we started. But if there are, right, if there are real material consequences here, and it's incumbent on us to make sure that those consequences are put in place, then we finally have the foundations of building something, that can actually create, a reasonable pathway to Palestinian liberation here. And this is a really hard piece because, like, yes, the whole world has turned against Israel, there's no question, and Western powers don't have any interest in pursuing this further or turning it into a real sort of, set of political actions that carry political cost, right? And I don't think we have to look very far to see that not only, do Western countries continue to have this like total unwillingness to censure and block Israel or whatever. Like, look at how they're treating Russia, right? Like, look at how they're treating Hungary. These states that even like, Europe and other Western states have considered to be enemies of the existing liberal order, like they're fine, like they're still part of the kind of broader economic system. Like Hungary is, this like anti-democratic state within the EU, and they still get EU subsidies. They still have free trade agreements. Like they're still deeply in it. So it's going to take a lot of pressure from the bottom, to ensure that the actual kind of boycott, divestment, embargoes, economic costs, the end of trade agreements, like all of that needs to happen. And now is the time to sort of start putting those things into place. And so that was my very complicated flowchart. Thank you for sitting with me in that. So I guess like the way that I would sum it up sort of is that we're in a moment where there's a real danger that this peace process, so-called, can turn into a very similar thing to what we saw in Oslo, right? Where the like underlying conditions are being placed in such a way and in such a structure that not only does the agreement itself basically make it impossible for Palestinian liberation to sort of exist, and to like, it basically re-cements Israeli hegemony under the guise of a peace process. But then that peace process is also used as a cudgel, right? For anyone who's speaking up on Palestine to be like, you're derailing the peace process, right? Like you got to let the process happen. So, the Palestinians are like, you have ongoing ICJ cases, you have ongoing, arrest warrants at the ICC for Netanyahu. Like you need to drop all of that because that's getting in the way of the peace process, right? And then like people, we're already hearing it, from some right wing and like Zionist commentators in the U.S. That like, oh, people are still protesting, like, like they're not willing to go along with the process. And like, yeah, obviously they want us to stop protesting, right? Because they want to be able to sort of control this entire thing from start to finish and to create a system that reverts back to the, pre-October 2023 status quo. And we all know, I'm sure everyone on this call knows, like, that's an untenable status quo. Like, it no longer exists. And we certainly don't want to go back to creating the conditions that allowed this genocide to happen in the first place. So it's really critical to make sure that we don't end up in another Oslo kind of situation where you end up with a totally disempowered Palestinian leadership that ends up, working basically as a implementer of Israel's wishes while anyone who's actively resisting is sort of shunted out and delegitimized using this process. And, Diana Blutu had this great article in The Guardian, basically talking about this, magic pill being the normalization process with Israel, and how like that, the Oslo process was used to say, we have to condone Israeli violence and you have to shut up about it because that's how we're going to get to peace. And obviously that's not how you get there. And so in the context of that, and in the context of the powers that be trying to use this particular political moment to rebuild Israel's global legitimacy and its regional hegemony, we're seeing this really big propaganda push, right? We've been seeing it obviously for the last 2 years, and now we're seeing it immediately start to accelerate and take on a new form. There's all kinds of things happening within traditional media, including this leaked fellowship idea where all of these people, including good old Van Jones and a bunch of other folks, are apparently are like mentoring younger journalists on how to be more pro-Israel in order to help fight the information war. Even more troubling than that, I would say, is this report that Israel is spending $500 million shekels using to try to get ChatGPT to become a public diplomacy tool. And this one is particularly insidious, not just because like they're using ChatGPT to create content to like convince people, which they are doing, but it's designed so that they're creating a bunch of fake websites so that when ChatGPT looks for answers to questions about Palestine, it uses that information as the basis to make its so-called analysis or whatever. So, but just spending almost unlimited amounts of money trying to reverse Israel's sort of collapse in public perception, which I think in many ways we can understand as a win, but we have to be wary of how that's going to change dynamics, particularly if the sort of like active version of the genocide starts to wane. In addition to these things, there's also a couple of ones that I thought were interesting, but we don't have to spend much time on. One, that it turns out that those like weird 3D models that the Israeli military had been putting out since back in 2023 that showed like underground Hamas bunkers, whatever, or like Hezbollah hiding rockets somewhere in Lebanon. No one's going to be surprised on this call to learn that those were fake, but an investigation has found like where they pulled those videos, like the rooms and like the infrastructure that they showed in those videos, and it came from like these like sci-fi whatever online communities that they like stole a bunch of images from, and then like the Scottish Maritime Museum's blueprints, like just total nonsense. They just created a bunch of stuff out of nowhere and then used it, and obviously the traditional media just gobbled that up. So like just goes to show the extent of their willingness to use this sort of propaganda. Yeah, and then other leaks about how U.S. Former and current U.S. officials have been secretly supporting the Israeli government in their like PR campaign. And then the last little bit of propaganda that I couldn't help but slip into the presentation today, just because we heard about the new Nobel Peace Prize going to Maria Corina Machado, who is a Venezuelan opposition activist who is like this like super hardcore Zionist, who her party has this alliance with the Likud party in Israel. And, she's said on a number of occasions, the struggle of Venezuela is the struggle of Israel, which like, I don't even know what that means, but gross. Great. This is the person who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think tells you a lot about the Nobel Peace Prize. In addition to the propaganda, obviously, we're seeing really heightened state repression. We've talked on past PSAs about the NSPM, which is the National Security Presidential Memorandum, I think, NSPM 7, which is now being implemented. This article from Ken Klippenstein actually does a really good job of going into the agency that's starting to implement this, and how just since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the number of people in the United States that they're now surveilling has tripled. And it's specifically just looking at folks who are, who espouse like anti-American values, right? Or like anti-Christian behavior, or, like extreme gender ideology or whatever. So us. And that's obviously a really terrifying development, and one that I think has largely been slipping under the radar and folks should be paying more attention to. Similarly, at a smaller scale. We've talked a lot about AB 715, and despite, universal opposition basically from teachers unions, school boards, educators, students, you name it, that bill was, this like so-called anti-Semitism bill, was just signed by Newsom this week, meaning that there will now be penalties for teachers or students criticizing Israel at California public schools. Just a terrifying development at the worst possible moment. So, if you wanted to tell Newsom how you feel about that, I would certainly encourage you to do so. Nevertheless, all of these acts of repression and propaganda or whatever are having blowback, right? Like we're seeing consequences from this, and we're seeing a moment where, again, Israel is more vulnerable than it's ever been, right? Just this week, we saw Italy's prime minister saying that like she has apparently been denounced to the ICC for her complicity in genocide directly. This is wild because Italy cut off arms sales to Israel back in 2023, and even then, they're still being considered as being complicit in genocide, which goes to show, right? Like, think about if Giorgia Meloni is complicit at that level, consider how complicit the U.S. government is, right? Or like the Germans or the Brits. And at the same time, just this week, the Spanish government has sort of formally enshrined their arms embargo that has already been in place, for over the last year or so, but now it's like been signed into law. So one of the first countries to really officially implement an arms embargo against Israel. Incredible development, and hopefully, one of many to come. And we're seeing a lot of this, of course, sort of on the back of rapidly changing public perspectives on what's happening and the like legitimacy of the Israeli state generally. So folks know I like to sort of spend a bit of time on polling every week. And so there's a new one this week from the Pew Center that I feel like really gets into some fascinating details here. In particular, the proportion of people who, the growing proportion of people who are specifically upset about U.S. military aid to Israel, which continues to go up, and Pew tends to be one of the more conservative pollsters on this, right? Other folks already show it above 50%. And even the way that like Pew frames the questions, it's often like, like, how do you feel about the U.S.'s support of Israel's attempt to stop Hamas, right? As opposed to like a more generalized question. And even framing it like that, over a third of people in the United States, and basically all Democrats, right, are like, no more aid to Israel, please. And obviously the perception of Israel or sympathizing with the Israelis is also cratering, right? It's the lowest it's ever been. And even among Republicans, there's a 40-point spread between young Republicans and older Republicans in support for Israel. So just a watershed moment of total change here. Whether the U.S. gerontocracy cares what the public thinks is a different question, but at some level, right, they're forced to sort of reckon with the deep unpopularity of these positions, and I think we are starting to see changes here, and we'll see more. Obviously, the Mamdani campaign is an example of this, but there's a lot more happening too, and I think this article, I think that's in The Guardian, gets into some of those sea changes. And sort of given this ongoing delegitimization of Israel, we're seeing material consequences from that, right? Like this pariah statehood is really becoming a thing. We saw this week a tech company in the Bay Area, Vercel, which I've never heard of, but okay. Their CEO posted a selfie with Netanyahu, and it turned into this like massive PR nightmare, which is amazing to see. Like tech bros are like, no, absolutely not. I won't work at a company where the CEO is taking selfies with a war criminal. And there was like a mass exodus of employees from that company. So, it's becoming this really big political liability. The vote on the fact that this vote is even happening incidentally, but there is an upcoming vote for all the broadcasters in Europe that broadcast Eurovision about whether or not to allow Israel to participate. I hate Eurovision, sorry, but it is a really big deal to a lot of people. And to Israelis in particular, are really, really into Eurovision. So the fact that Israel might be blacklisted is already a really big deal. And then if they are, that'll be incredible. Even the BBC has gone on record saying, like, we don't know how we're going to vote on this. And folks know how much water the BBC has carried for Israel over the course of this genocide. So even that tells us a lot. And so as a result of that, we are seeing the marginalization of like Zionist forces in the United States in a way that I never thought that I would see in my lifetime. Like just, a couple of days ago, APAC changed their like Twitter banner, whatever you might call it. And like, look at this. 5 million American members, funded by Americans, directed by Americans, strengthening alliance that benefits America. It reeks of desperation, right? Like they've been attacked so much for being a foreign agent, which they are, that they're taking this sort of defensive posture that I think is a really incredible thing to see, right? They're really on their back foot in a way that I don't think any of us expected quite so soon. Similarly, like folks like Van Jones are getting absolutely wrecked. He made those awful comments on Real Time with Bill Maher a couple days ago about like um, youth falling for Palestinian propaganda by seeing dead babies. And like senators are going out of their way to be like, this is disgusting. And Van Jones, you're an awful human being. So like, again, a massive sea change in the discourse here. Turning that change in the discourse into something that actually produces material changes is our fight, right? Like it's not enough that we're seeing a discourse change. And there is like the reason there's such a massive propaganda investment right now is that the Israeli government and its supporters will be pushing really hard to use this ceasefire as a way to shift back the tides. And it's incumbent on us, right, to not stop protesting, right, to continue to put pressure on Israel and its enablers, right, to stop the genocide of the Palestinians, which is going to continue whether or not the IDF is actively in Gaza, to ensure that the process of the ceasefire is actually producing something that can sustain Palestinian life and liberation, and to completely cut out and marginalize the defenders of this genocide from the sort of political conversation in this country and anywhere else. And so just to sum up in our last few minutes, the ceasefire, despite its many problems and the high risks of it sort of falling apart at some point, is still a really monumental development. And it's one that I think, as we said right at the top, needs to be understood in its nuanced complexity, right? It's good and it's bad. It's promising and it's devastating, right? It's a step forward and a step back. And we need to understand all of those pieces and address them strategically, given that we now find ourselves in this moment and not the moment that we were in before. It's worth noting, of course, that our opponents will be doing the same, right? And they'll be using this moment to try to defang Palestinian resistance, both like on the ground and here, to consolidate Israel as a regional hegemon and to like open up, these neoliberal markets for exploitation of the Palestinian people. It's our fight right now to make sure that that doesn't happen, and it's going to be a long fight, and it's going to be a hard fight. But we've won a lot more in these last 2 years than I think many of us expected to, despite the fact that we did not stop the genocide. We have massively changed the underlying political foundations on which that genocide was built. And we must continue to do that until those political foundations are completely remade. And part of that is, we are in this moment of sharpening contradictions, and, we've had some strange bedfellows over the last couple of years. Among them are people who did not like the genocide, but just want things to go back to the way that they were. Those people will soon be breaking with us, and we need to sort of recognize that that's going to happen and be prepared to continue to uphold our principles that it's not just about stopping the last 2 years of Israel's acute violence, but changing the material conditions that allowed this genocide to happen, not just to the Palestinian people, but to anyone, right? We can't let this happen again. And we can't allow the material conditions for this level of human suffering to happen again anywhere. And so there needs to be a massive political shift here, and it's incumbent on us to birth that new political order. So get ready. The next phase of the fight might be starting. We might go back to where things were a week ago, but if it is starting, a lot depends on our resilience and commitment, and I'm honored to be in that fight with you all. And lastly, there is a rally today for Gaza in support of the Palestinian people in this really pivotal moment at 5:30 in front of the federal building. I would say I hope to see you there, but I am out of the country, so I hope you all are there. And I did want to point people, it's not an event, but I did want to point people to Iraq's statement on the ceasefire. If you haven't read it yet, would recommend that you do so. And if you want to hear about other events, you can always check out the Iraq calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text alerts, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And you can check out the PAL Media Tracker for the articles that inform this analysis. There's a lot this week. You can sign up for a weekly digest of those articles at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that'll be the end.